The life of Anne Frank is a tale of tragedy, love, and unimaginable evil, and some of it remains a mystery even today. So what do we know about the young author's final months? The entire Frank family was forced into hiding when Anne was just 13 years old. That was in July 1942. About a month earlier, her father had given her a diary for her birthday. Anne began using it immediately, and not even the Nazis could stop her.
She asked me several times, "Father, see that nobody's disturbing me. I want to write in my diary."
Anne didn't record an entry every single day, but she did write with surprising frequency, all things considered. In fact, there's an interesting twist to her diary entries. We'll get to that later in the video. Her diary is truly remarkable reading. In her writing, Anne displays not only vulnerability and understanding of the horror she was facing, but also a great deal of tenacity and resourcefulness. Anne's family had access to a radio in the attic in which they hid, and they'd often tune in to the BBC so they could keep up to date with the events of the war. In one of her more poignant entries from June 6, 1944, Anne wrote about the D-Day offensive and expressed her hopes that she might be able to soon leave her hiding place. In her penultimate entry on July 21, 1944, Anne wrote about the July 20th plot on Adolf Hitler's life, which gave her even more hope that the end of the war was nigh. Her final journal entry was on August 1, 1944. On August 4th, she and her family were discovered and arrested by the Nazis. After their arrest, the Frank family was first sent to a prison camp and then a detention center. On September 3, 1944, they were sent to Auschwitz. There, Anne lived under constant threat of being sent to the gas chambers. Living conditions were appalling too. The Nazis provided prisoners with little food and water, barely enough to survive on. Anne quickly contracted scabies due to the camp's filthy conditions, and it fell to her sister Margot to take care of her. The two girls were also with their mother Edith. They had been separated from their father Otto. While Anne was still sick, the Nazis took both her and Margot from Auschwitz and sent them to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Although Bergen-Belsen wasn't an extermination camp like Auschwitz, conditions were so poor that countless prisoners died of sickness and disease.
We were numbed into non-existent, being non-existent.
Sadly, by the time the Allies finally liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, both Margot and Anne were dead. When Anne Frank arrived at Bergen-Belsen, she was reunited with many of her old friends from before her time in hiding. One of them was Hannah Pitt-Goslar, a former neighbor of Anne's. Hannah tracked down Anne in the camp in February 1944, and the two girls were able to talk to each other through a barbed wire fence.
Somebody told me, "Your friend Anne Frank is here, the other side of the fence."
Anne was apparently distraught at her family's situation. Hannah later gave her a small care package that she had received from the Red Cross, but she never saw Anne again after that. Another friend Anne saw in the camp was Nanette Blitz-Koenig, a former classmate. Nanette had spotted Anne through one of the camp's fences and managed to track her down. Their reunion was bittersweet, however, as they both reflected on the losses they had suffered over the previous few years. Anne told Nanette about her time in Auschwitz, and the two dreamed about life after the war's end. Nanette and Hannah also knew each other. Both survived the Holocaust, and both would later write about their experiences with Anne. One of the great horrors suffered by Jewish children in the Holocaust was the fact that most had no idea what became of their family and friends. In September 1944, the Nazis had sent the entire Frank family to Auschwitz, but only Anne and Margot were taken on to Bergen-Belsen a month later. According to Hannah Pitt-Goslar, Anne was absolutely certain that both of her parents had died at Auschwitz, and she was obviously devastated about having lost them. However, in her own account, Nanette Blitz-Koenig says that Anne was concerned about both of her parents' fates and that she hadn't known what had befallen them.
Anne thought she's the last one of the family, and then you are not making such an effort anymore.
As it would later turn out, Edith passed away at Auschwitz in January 1945, while Otto survived through to the camp's liberation. After the war, Otto established a number of charities in his daughter's name and was instrumental in getting her diaries published.
In a certain way, through her diary, she is living on in many hearts.
He died in 1980 at the age of 91. Anne Frank had actually wanted her diary to be published even as she was writing it. So the twist to her diary is that there are actually two versions. Well, kinda. You see, around May 1944, Anne began rewriting her diary. For one thing, she was a bit older now, and she wanted to remove part of the childlike entries, and in a sense, she was editing her work for future publication. Towards the end of her time in the annex, she heard a BBC broadcast that contained a speech from the Dutch cabinet minister Gerrit Volkstein. Bolkestein implored those who were suffering through Nazi occupation to keep their memoirs and other written pieces that represented their struggles, in the hopes that they would one day be able to publish them as living testaments to the Holocaust and war. Anne was moved by Bolkestein's words, and she made plans to publish her diary as a book under the title The Secret Annex. Anne even had aspirations of becoming a writer after the war, and she was excited about the possibility of the diary being published, even during her darkest days of her imprisonment. Sadly, she died before getting the chance to live out her dreams, but her diary has since become one of the most important works on the Holocaust. Around a month after Anne and her sister Margot were taken to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, an incident occurred that was shocking even by the camp's grim standards. That December, one of the imprisoned dentists at the camp, Dr. Hadassah Rosenstoff, was forced to create a makeshift home for nearly 50 young orphan Jewish children who had been abandoned there by the Nazis. The children's parents had been sent to a different concentration camp, and the children themselves were left outside in the bitter cold of the Northern European winter.
You could be speaking to someone and they just die in front of you.
Had Dr. Rosenstoff and the other women at Bergen-Belsen not taken care of the children, they would have almost certainly perished in the harsh conditions, and the Nazis soon left even more in their care. In all, 150 children were looked after in the home, and the caretakers there included the Frank sisters. A friend of Anne and Margot says that both sisters helped care for the children under Dr. Rosenstoff's protection, even though they were both only teenagers at the time. Amazingly, only one of the 150 children taken in died at Bergen-Belsen, and both Anne and Margot played a part in their survival. Though Anne and Margot Frank's imprisonment at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was no doubt horrific, they were at least able to endure it together. Tragically, though, both of them ended up contracting typhus during their time at the camp. According to first-hand accounts, Margot was the sicker of the two. She was particularly susceptible to cold, and so she suffered greatly in the winter conditions. On top of that, both her and Anne's bunk was near the ground and close to the door of their barracks, meaning they were hit by freezing air every time someone came in or out. Those who saw Margot noted how increasingly gaunt she became as her illness grew more and more severe, and she soon lost most of her strength. When she became too weak to get out of bed, Anne would go to the nurses at the camp and try to get a hold of fresh blankets and supplies, a necessity considering their own had become infested with lice. Though ultimately futile, Anne's care of her sister may have helped prolong her life, even if only by a few days. And if nothing else, it was an incredible demonstration of fortitude and resilience. Bergen-Belsen originally opened as a prisoner of war camp in 1940, but became a concentration camp in 1943. By January 1945, a few months after Anne's arrival, conditions there had deteriorated to the point of near collapse. The camp was becoming exceedingly overcrowded as more prisoners came in every day, a problem compounded by the poor sanitary conditions and a severe shortage of food and water.
Nobody cleaned anything up. It was just a devastated place.
At times, prisoners had to endure multiple days without food or water, and the guards would taunt them by leaving potentially poisoned delicacies in the camp. Hundreds of prisoners were dying daily towards the end, too many to cremate, and bodies began piling up around the camp. Disease spread as a result, and lice and fleas infested many camp prisoners. Due to inadequate clothing, many prisoners were also subjected to frostbite in the winter's conditions, and Anne's own quarters provided little protection against the elements. Conditions at Bergen-Belsen were so horrendous that when the British arrived to liberate the camp in April 1945, many soldiers refused to enter for fear of contracting disease.
Barbed wire everywhere, chaos, bodies.
Anne and her sister were just two of roughly 50,000 people who perished at Bergen-Belsen. When Anne and Margot Frank first arrived at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, they were malnourished but active and still able to communicate with the other prisoners. According to her autobiography, Nanette Blitz-Koenig talked with both Anne and Margot several times while they were imprisoned at the camp. At some point, however, the Frank sisters both came down with typhus. More than likely, they contracted the disease from body lice, which were rampant at Bergen-Belsen. Margot was sicker than Anne as she was bedridden, while Anne was still able to leave her barracks and talk with other prisoners. Fellow prisoners at Bergen-Belsen said that Margot died before Anne did after she fell out of her bunk and was too frail to pick herself back up. The two shared a bunk, which meant that Anne was likely just feet away from her sister when she died. If Anne was still alive and conscious, it's impossible to imagine the grief she must have felt at the loss of her sister. At first, the Dutch government listed Margot's death date as March 27, 1945, as they needed a singular date for official purposes. But researchers now speculate that she passed away in February 1945, around her would-be 19th birthday, and likely only days before Anne. Sadly, this was also mere months before Allied forces liberated Bergen-Belsen. Anne Frank's story came to a tragic end at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. At just 15 years old, Anne died of typhus fever. It's not known exactly when Anne became infected, but since it takes about 2 to 3 weeks for typhus to turn fatal, she more than likely became ill in either late January or early February 1945. According to fellow prisoners such as Rachel von Ameron and Frankfurter, who saw Anne in the months before her death, both the illness and the camp's lack of provisions took a heavy toll. Von Ameron and Frankfurter describes Anne as emaciated. Writing about Anne and Margot, she recalled, "You could really see both of them dying." A few days before her death, Anne began to hallucinate due to her severe fever. Soon after, she threw out her clothes, which were infested with lice and fleas, but Anne had nothing to replace them with, forcing her to wrap herself in a single blanket as her only protection from the elements. Anne died a day or two after Margot and about 2 months before the camp's liberation. Initially, her date of death was listed as March 31st, 1945, but historians now believe it occurred about a month and a half earlier, in mid-February. Far more importantly than her exact death date, Anne's tale of resistance and perseverance lives on as an inspiration to millions. Today, her life and her diary stand as a testament to the horrors of the Holocaust and a reminder that such evil must never be allowed to resurface.